Hello and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. I'm one of your hosts, Dan Hall. And for the longest time, I have been interested in the UFO uh, myth. Well, some people would call it a myth. I just was talking with our guest tonight about some people still consider it a myth. As somebody who's a MUFON investigator, I don't put much stock in that, but we're very fortunate to have Kevin Randle on our show. Kevin is one of the first authors I ever read anything about Roswell. And we were just talking before the show. I went to the 50th anniversary of Roswell, and he was a presenter there. So I think we're very fortunate to have Kevin with us tonight. Kevin, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and you're looking
Okay.
good.
Yeah, thanks. I guess people usually don't say that. Anyway, so let's get into this story that's so fascinating. So, your history is you were a helicopter pilot, right? If I remember.
Helicopter, helicopter pilot, aircraft commander in Vietnam, and a battalion intelligence officer in Iraq. I
Yeah.
served during I served during three wars: Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and Iraqi freedom. I did not deploy during the Gulf War, so I was only in two of the wars, but I served during three.
Yeah. And you're also a very prolific writer. You write fiction and nonfiction books. So help me thread the needle here. How did somebody with that background end up with Don Schmidt investigating whatever happened in Roswell?
I think to understand that I have to go back far, far away. My mother was interested in science fiction,
Huh?
and she took me to see a movie, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, when I was a little
I've
kid.
seen that movie. Yeah.
And that kind of sparked my interest. In high school, I remember reading one of Brad Steiger's books, Strangers from the Sky. And so I've always had this interest in UFOs. And after I got back from Vietnam, I was going to college. And because I'd only been a warrant officer, I could take ROTC and get a commission. And in the class was a guy named Bob Cornett, and we kind of hit it off, and we both wanted to be science fiction writers. So we wrote some science fiction short stories, and we wrote some books, science fiction books. And in the process, we learned about science fiction conventions, which were held weekly. There, you can find one almost every week, and sometimes two or three on a weekend in various places in the United States. Um, so we would go to the science fiction conventions, and I was one in Wisconsin when they said we're going to have a debate between science fiction writers and these guys coming up from the Center for UFO Studies. And I was going to be on the science fiction writer side, and I will drop a name here, which I think is right. I think that George R. R. Martin was actually at that convention because at the time he lived in, I think, Dubuque, Iowa. So it
Hmm.
was going to be Fred Pohl, George R. R. Martin, me against these two or three guys coming up from CUFOS. When they arrived, it was just Don Schmidt. So I said, well, it's a debate. I'll change sides. Because in a debate, you're supposed to be able to do that.
Yeah, right.
So I was going to be on the side with Don Schmidt, and we kind of hit it off. A couple of weeks later, he called me and said they were going to reopen the Roswell investigation. And did I want to help them? And he thought my military background would be of use because we've talking to witnesses with a lot of them career officers in the military and things like that. And I would be able to relate to them and understand what they were saying a little bit better than a civilian who'd never served. So that's how I got dragged into the Roswell case. Now, I'd been writing not science fiction, but UFO stories. I put myself through college writing UFO stories for the various magazines. There used to be six magazines devoted to UFOs in the mid 1970s. UFO Report, Argosy's UFOs, True's Flying Saucers and UFOs, Official UFO, a couple of others like that. And I had built up a good backlog of those stories. And it seemed like every semester when my tuition came due, I would successfully publish a story with Saga in their UFO report. And it covered all my tuition except for $10. So I always say I went to college on my Saga scholarship, but I had been doing a lot of UFO writing in magazines. And once we got to that convention and Don wanted to go to Roswell, we both thought we were going to get down there and solve the thing in a matter of days because we all know that UFOs didn't crash. We'd grown up in that era where the Aztec crash had been thoroughly debunked by the San Francisco Chronicle, I think it was. And everybody you talk to, from the Lorenzens who ran APRO to Don Kehoe at NICAP and many of the other smaller organizations, just didn't accept any stories about UFO crashes, that they were all hoax. Till then, Stringfield kind of turned that around when Jesse Marcel came out. But because of that, Don said, well, let's go down to Roswell. And I said, okay. And we got down there. The trip kind of blew up. The first guy we were supposed to see was Frank Joyce, who was one of the reporters and newscasters at KGFL, the station down there. And he begged off because he didn't feel well. We went to a meeting of a group in Albuquerque who were very new age, very out there, and had nothing to contribute to us. When we got down to Roswell, we met with Cliff Stone. And I always wondered why would a family name their son Cliff Stone? You know, it's kind of like Paige Turner and some of these other bizarre names. Well, anyway,
Yeah.
Cliff didn't want to meet us at his house. He wanted to meet us at the local Burger King. He shows up in uniform, which he was working at the New Mexico Military Institute as an administrative assistant. He shows up in uniform, which I thought was just a little bit strange. And his address was in the telephone book. So I'm wondering, why can't we meet at the house? Well, eventually we did. But we met with Cliff Stone. He didn't contribute much to what we could do. And we're thinking, well, this trip's a bust. We really haven't got anywhere. It probably was a weather balloon. Then we met Bill Brazel, the son of the man that found it, and that turned the whole thing around. And as we were going back to Albuquerque to catch our airplane, I said, Don, you know, we've got to come back because there's so much more to talk to. We met a fellow that introduced us to the family of Sheriff Wilcox. We got together with Walter Hott and some of the other people down in Roswell. So we came back and we came back and we came back, and we eventually sat down to put down what we knew on paper as best as we could based on our investigation. And we did weird things. We were told that there was a guy who had photographs, but all we knew was his name was Stanton. Is Stanton something? And so we went to the tax assessor's office, and I said to him, can you sort by first names? And he said, yeah. So we gave him the first name, and they came up with two businesses and this one guy. We went to visit him, and he really didn't know anything and didn't have any pictures. But I mean, that's the kind of level that we delved into, that we assessed the county assessor's office to see if we could get to the guy who had the pictures, but we didn't fail there. And for those of you who can read body language, you know, I'm not lying to you. My nose actually itched. So, but that kind of started.
Let's start with some of those names. I think that's an interesting introduction to Roswell. Let's start with Mac Brazel. Who was he and how did he fit into this narrative?
Well, Mac Brazel was the ranch foreman on what was a Foster ranch at the time. So he lived on the ranch. He took care of the ranch for the Foster family. And in early July, there was a series of thunderstorms that passed through, and he heard a clap of thunder or something that sounded strange. He went outside and really didn't see anything. The next day, he was in the fields looking to see which pastures got rain, because as those of us who have been around a long time know, that sometimes the rain misses places. So he was looking where the rain had fallen so they could move the sheep and the cattle to those pastures. And he came across a field filled with this metallic debris. And his thought was, well, who's going to clean up this mess? And people told him, well, it's probably something with the military. You ought to go down to Roswell and see what they can do. I never really understood that. He should have gone to Alamogordo because I think it was closer, but he went to Roswell. At the time, I believe this is correct, that the ranch was actually in Chavez County. It was like the largest county in the country at the time, and they've cut it up a little bit. So he went to see the sheriff, who was George Wilcox. And when Brazel came into the office, one of Wilcox's daughter, Phyllis, was there in the office as well. So she saw Mac Brazel. And I mention that because at that time, the sheriff had an apartment or quarters above the jail, and his wife, the wife of the sheriff, would normally sort of operate as the matron of the jail as well. So they were there. Brazel talked to the sheriff. He says, we will call out to the base. The call was answered by Jesse Marcel, who was the base intelligence officer. He came in, talked to the sheriff, looked at the debris that Brazel had brought in, and I think that's kind of a key here. Marcel saw the debris in the sheriff's office, and then he couldn't identify it, so he went back out to the base. He talked to Colonel Blanchard, the base commander, who said, "Well, we got this new counterintelligence guy. Why don't you go out there and take it with him?" That was Sheridan Cavett,
Sheridan
who,
Cavett, right? Okay.
yeah, one of the big debunkers on this. They went out to the ranch, saw the metallic debris. They picked up a great deal of it. They both brought some of it back. The next day, which I believe was July 8th, that's when they made the announcement um, about catching or capturing a flying saucer ranch on the Roswell region. Had a meeting about that. Marcel was flown to Fort Worth, which was the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, and the 509th Bomb Group station at Roswell was a part of the 8th Air Force. It was the next higher headquarters. So they sent debris there. The sheriff was involved, like I said, George Wilcox. Walter Hott was given the assignment of publicizing the find. And he wasn't even sure about this himself. He said he couldn't remember whether he wrote the press release or Blanchard dictated it to him over the phone, or if he was given the instructions and one of the NCOs that worked for him wrote the press release, but then he took it to the 4 media outlets in Roswell. And at around 2 o'clock Mountain Time, it went out over the wires from the radio station KSWS, which was George Walsh, and KGFL with Frank Joyce put it on their wire as well, and the story broke from that point. So when we were there, people we talked to Phyllis McGuire, of course. We talked to her sister, Elizabeth Tolk. We talked to her husband, who sometimes did work for the sheriff. We talked to the people who worked at the Roswell Daily Record at the time, talked to people who worked at the Morning Dispatch. We talked to ranchers. We talked to officers who were retired. I talked, for example, to Edwin Easley. He was this provost marshal in Roswell, provost marshal being like the chief of police. So his responsibility was security at the website, security at the crash site. And he told me something that was kind of interesting as we were talking about it. He wouldn't admit to having been out there, wouldn't admit to seeing the flying saucer or anything like that, because he kept saying, well, I was sworn to secrecy. And I said, well, I heard that Mac Brazel was held at the base. And he said, yeah, he was in the guest house for a while. Not exactly jail, but if you're not allowed to leave, then it's the next best thing.
And why was he held? What was your
They
thought
they
about
they,
that?
they were getting the story straight,
Hmm.
which means they were coming up with the explanation for it. Because I think in 1947, if you look at the societal elements at that time, much different than it is today. People believe the military, believe the government, and that sort of thing. And so when they said something, the people accepted it. Brazel was there for, I think, 5 to 7 days, depending on when he was picked up on July 9th. His son, Bill Brazel, who we also talked to at length, saw his name in the paper, saw his father's name in the paper, and said, well, there's nobody at the ranch. So Bill Brazel was living in Albuquerque at the time, and said, well, I've got to go down and take care of the ranch. Said that to his wife. So he got there a couple of days later, and then his dad showed up a couple of days later. So it's like 5 to 7 days that he was held at the base. At one point, he was seen being escorted around by Air Force, well, actually Army Air Force officers at the time, taken to the newspaper and that sort of thing to give the story. So I think one of the reason he was staying there, kept there, was so that he could kind of put out part of the fire. So the military was controlling the rancher who found it. Jesse Marcel, who had been out there, he was sent to Fort Worth, so he was kind of out of the loop. Sheridan Cavett, nobody knew who he was, so it didn't even figure in the story in 1947. He went out there clearly, and he later admitted to that. But when we first met Sheridan Cavett, by the way, and I digress, I realize, he said, well, I wasn't even there at the time. And after we talked to him for a while, he said to us, do you guys now believe me? I wasn't there. Well, it turns out he was there, and he finally admitted to that.
Yeah.
So, but those are signs of some of the key players from 1947. We talked to Joe Briley, for example. He was the operations officer in 1947. We talked to we didn't talk to Kent Jeffrey talked to Barrowclaw, I think it was Barrowclaw, Colonel Barrowclaw, who said that there was nothing happened. It wasn't there. And he told Ken Jeffrey that, and he sent Ken Jeffrey notes, says, well, now I hope you'll believe me when I say nothing happened. So of all the officers we could talk to who were still around or who had left some kind of record, Jesse Marcel Sr., of course, we didn't get to talk to. He died about 4 years before we got involved, but he left records in the form of video interviews and that sort of thing. So we could see what he had to say about that. Every
Well,
member of the Colonel,
didn't
pardon
he
me,
also didn't he also share some material with his son? Jesse.
he chose. Yes, yes. After he had been out there on went out there. It was there on the day of July 7th. I think it went out on July 6th. He was there most of the day on July 7th. And as he came back to Roswell, he made a detour to show his wife and his son what he'd found, and then he took it on out to the base. So yes, and we talked to Jesse Marcel Jr., of course.
And
Um,
what did they say about the material? Because I thought that was an important part of the story.
well, I want to get this one point out,
Okay.
which you've now pushed out of my brain.
sorry, sorry
First,
about that.
um, it was every officer we could talk to, with one exception. That was Barrowclaw, said it was some kind of craft. Um, Jesse Jr. talked about the I-beam with the embossed writing on it. It was not writing as we think of, more like hieroglyphics, but it doesn't match any of the hieroglyphics that we would be familiar with, because obviously it was developed by an alien race, and it had nothing to do with the Egyptians or the Sumerians or the people who used hieroglyphics in their communications. Um,
It
there
also
was
had a unique substance to it, right? If it was crumpled up, it kind of all folded up, it unfolded. That
Well, I was going to get to that, because we talked to Bill Brazel Jr. and he, of course, went down to the ranch, and he said whenever he was out in that field, he'd kind of look around, and he said he found 10 or a dozen small pieces. He said one of them was like, he said what he said was, the kind of material you can shine a light, a wire-like material, you can shine the light in one end and it comes out the other. Talking about fiber optics, obviously. He said there was a wood-like material, very lightweight, like balsa wood, but with his pocket knife, and he said he used his pocket knife to cut barbed wire. He said he wanted to get shaving to see if there was any stratification, and he couldn't cut it at all. And then, of course, he said that the most fascinating thing was he had this piece of foil, and he had it in a chap's pocket, and he took it out and he threw it down on the table, and it unfolded itself. So he started playing around with that, and he would fold it up and unfold itself without a sign of a crease or a wrinkle. So we had that description from him. We had descriptions of the material that Jesse Marcel Sr. talked about. Bill Rickett, who was in the counterintelligence office, he was the NCOIC, the senior non-commissioned officer, working directly under Sheridan Cavett, who was the officer in charge. Bill Rickett said that he'd gone out to what we now understand is the impact site, not the debris field that Mac Brazel found, but a site where the craft actually came down, which was much closer to Roswell than at the site near Corona, New Mexico. And he was out there. He said he was out there with the provost marshal and Cavett, and they were looking at the stuff. And he picked up this piece of debris that was thin but very strong. He said it was like cold rolled steel. And he said he was trying to bend it, and they were kind of laughing at him. He says he's trying to do what none of us could do, which bend the stuff. So we're talking about material that was very strong in that respect. So we talked to a lot of people who saw debris. We talked to a lot of people who, a lot of the people claimed to have seen bodies, but later on, it turned out most of them were kind of fudging on that. We talked to a couple people who had seen bodies, which was important. One of the guys, I'm going to have to scratch my nose again. I'm sorry. I know you're not supposed to touch your nose, but it itches, for crying out loud.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the interesting things is Walter Hott, in his later years, talked about seeing the bodies and left an affidavit with material about that in the early 21st century. Don Schmidt wrote out the affidavit, which I have no problem with Don Schmidt writing it out. It was with Walter Hott, who was in his 80s at the time. His daughter, Julie Schuster, was there, and Don Schmidt, and took notes. And Don Schmidt prepared the affidavit, and then Hott read it over and read it and signed it in the presence of a notary public. So, just the fact that Don Schmidt wrote the affidavit really is irrelevant to the story, but I mentioned it anyway. And he talked about seeing the craft and seeing the bodies. And I was a little leery about this because for literally decades, the decades I knew him, we would talk about this. And once in a while, I'd ask him about bodies or try to trip him up by, asking him a series of questions, kind of bang, 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 bang. And then when did you see the bodies? And he never fell for the gag. But in the mid 1990s, I guess it was, I was interviewing a guy named Richard Harris, I think, who was an assistant finance officer in Roswell in 1947. And his name is in the Roswell yearbook, so we know he was there at the right time. And he told me a story at that time that he was in the hangar where the bodies had been stored, and was talking to Walter Hott, and Hott said, "You want to see them? They're in the next room." And Harris said he put his hand on the door and he was going to open it, and then he decided he didn't want to see the bodies, so he didn't open the door. The point of that is Harris told me that story before Walter Hott ever admitted that he had seen the bodies. So I think it's an interesting bit of corroboration for Walter Hott's story. But so we were talking to all these people about what was going on. We talked to people who had handled the debris. We talked to Frankie Rowe, who was the daughter of a firefighter, and she was in Roswell, and I think she said, having a dental appointment. And when it was over, she went to the firehouse to wait for her father, who was a lieutenant in the fire department, to take her home. And there was a state policeman in there who had a piece of the debris, the metallic, the foil-like material that would fold up. So she got to handle that. So we talked to her. There was a guy, oh good Lord, I can't remember his name now. I can see in my mind clear as day.
Can't remember his name though.
The videotape of him sitting there, and the lighting was really poor because we weren't doing any of this for broadcast. We were doing it for so that when people challenge us, we can say, well, this is what we were told, and here's the evidence of it. Because there was a number of people who challenged us on things and said, well, you misquoted so and so, and I would send the tapes to him and say, tell me where we misquoted you. General Exxon was one of those. General Exxon was at Wright Patterson, Wright Field at the time in 1947. The material was shipped there, and he said he talked to people who had handled the debris and seen the bodies, and he talked about flying over the crash sites, the tool crash sites in 1947.
There's more than one, right?
Yeah, there was the debris field up near Corona. Then there was an impact site where the craft and the bodies were found closer to Roswell, about 40 minutes from Roswell, as opposed to 3 hours from Roswell. So, we talked to an awful lot of people who handled debris. We talked to some people who had seen the bodies. We talked to some people who claimed to have seen the bodies. And I think of Frank Kaufman here, who turned out not to be telling us the truth. He was at Roswell in 1947. He was there in a civilian capacity. He's in the yearbook. And Payne Jennings, who was, I forget whether he was the executive officer or the deputy commander. He was one of the 3 top officers in Roswell in 1947. There's a picture of him being presented with a medal in 1947, and looking at the picture, but it's black and white, so I'm not sure. I think it's a World War II victory medal it's being presented with, which I think is kind of an everybody medal. If you served in World War II, you got the World War II. You got one of those. In my time, the everybody medal was the National Defense Service Medal. Everybody who was in during the Vietnam War got it. Then during the Gulf War, there was peacetime between, I think it was August 14th, August 14th, 1974. If you served after that, you were no longer authorized the National Defense Service Medal. And then it was reauthorized during the Gulf War. And then there was a period where you couldn't get it. And then it was reauthorized for Iraqi freedom. So I served during 3 periods, so I got 3 of them,
Hmm.
one at different times. But so anyway, Kaufman, I think, was getting a World War II victory medal. And so that kind of added to his credibility. We later learned that he was basically making everything up. We caught him in a number of half truths and lies and things like that, and were able to discredit his testimony, which is interesting because the skeptics were always saying, well, he wasn't there, he didn't do this, and they had no evidence for it. But some of them, like Philip Klass, knew there's no such thing as alien visitation. Ergo, anything that suggests there's alien visitation, it must be a lie or a hoax.
Well, that's where
We,
Philip Klass was coming from, though. He was a
yeah, that's,
professional skeptic.
yeah. Well, he would, he said Kaufman was lying. It was Mark Rodiker, Don Schmidt, and Mark Chesney who actually got the final evidence proving that Kaufman was lying. But the point simply is they didn't have the proof. We went out and found it. And then, of course, published it as quickly as we could because, I mean, we're trying to get to the truth on this whole thing. So there's, go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, Kevin, let me stop you and ask this question. What, if anything, did you find out about the nature of the craft? And then maybe a more interesting question is, why did something that could come great distances across the Gulf of space, why does something like that crash?
Well, I think we had the debris field, which was found up by Corona by Mac Brazel. And to me, it looked like he talked about a lot of metallic debris broken up and scattered over a large area in this pasture. I think it looked like it was some kind of shielding that came apart or something went wrong. And then there was like an escape pod or a smaller craft that carried on for another 40 or 50 miles before it crashed near Roswell.
And what was the description of that, if there was one? What did
The
that look
only
like?
the only description I have seen is kind of a pod. Um, when I hear that, I think of, and I hesitate to use the term, the TikTok shape of they talk
Oh,
about, but something like an escape pod or something like that. Well, when you say why did it crash, I have no clue. I will point out that there's always somebody to push the wrong button, which may have done that. And my favorite theory, and I preface it by saying it is complete and total speculation, and I don't think it's what happened, but I always loved this idea, which I'd come up with. And skeptics would say, well, Randle has explained it as this. And I would write to them and say, no, what I said was, so I was being misquoted, but it was done on purpose. And they crashed it to show that they were non-hostile. They were somebody could were fragile like us and that sort of thing. That we could relate to them in that fashion. And the unfortunate thing is they crashed it in the wrong place. And well, did they kill their own people? Well, no. Maybe they had some bodies that creatures that had passed away and used them, or maybe they were artificial intelligence, so it didn't make any difference, but they had done it on purpose to announce themselves to the world. But the 509th Bomb Group in the U.S. Army managed to subvert that plan. I don't believe that for a minute. I just think it's kind of a neat way to announce yourself to an alien race so that they aren't scared when you do show up.
Right, they're vulnerable.
But I don't know why they crashed. I'm up with you. I would think that they've defeated interstellar space. But I also think of this not necessarily being an interstellar craft, but more of a craft that like the airplanes we carry on an aircraft carrier. So they had different kind of craft for different missions. I mean, if you ask people, an aircraft carrier lands, docks close by, and people don't know what it is and they don't know about their aircraft, you would see helicopters, you'd see jets, you'd see airplanes with propellers, you'd see all kinds of aircraft in different configurations. So there wouldn't be a single type of craft explained or described. That's the best analogy I can come up with for that. So maybe it was a craft that wasn't as completely shielded as it could have been. I don't think lightning or radar brought it down, but
Right.
something went wrong and it exploded in the air, and the crew
What, if any,
was killed.
What, if anything, did you learn about the nature of the creatures? And were they all, had they all expired at the time?
There again, we run into problems. Frankie Rowe's father, the firefighter, Dan Dwyer, said that he had gone out there and he said two of the creatures were deceased and one of them was still alive walking around.
Hmm.
But that's secondhand testimony from Frankie Rowe. It's not what Dwyer said, because Dwyer, again, had died before we had a chance to talk with him. There was a big controversy about that, too, about why didn't the Roswell Fire Department go out to the site? And Carl Flock, in his book, made a big deal about that. Here's Dan Dwyer talking about going out to the site, but the Roswell Fire Department didn't go. I went through the records from the Roswell Fire Department, and one of the criticisms was the Roswell Fire Department didn't go outside the city limits to fight fires. Well, when I was there in 1990 and talking to the firefighters, I asked them about it. I said, well, what are we supposed to do? Let it burn? But they had their records going back to 1947. So I could go to the books and I see where all the things they had done in June and July of 1947. And there was no indication that they had gone out there. And Carl Flock talked to a guy in Roswell, retired firefighter, and said, no, we didn't go out there. We didn't have anything to do with that. And that's what he published in his book. Well, I talked to the guy too sometime later, and he was telling me the same thing. We didn't go out there. And I said, did you know Dan Dwyer? He said, yeah, he went out there. And I said, oh. He says, yeah, this colonel came by the office, came by the fire station. And it's always a colonel. It's never a captain, never a major, always a colonel. And there weren't that many colonels at Roswell at the time, but it could have been one of them anyway. Came by the fire station, says, don't worry about it. We've got it covered. You won't need to go out there. But Dan Dwyer climbed in his personal car and did go out there, according to this retired firefighter, which kind of corroborates Frankie Rowe's tale as well. So, we looked into that sort of thing. So he was talking about one walking around. There was some discussion, secondhand discussion about one of them walking into the base hospital. Melvin
The
Brown,
creature
the
from the craft.
creature. Melvin Brown, who was an NCO, he was a cook, but anybody who's gone through Army basic training knows that we're all trained as riflemen and we're all trained to how to do guard duty. And when something big like this came down, you'd be going across the base, picking up all the people you could to help with the security. And you don't have to have a lot of training to stand guard. Well, he was out there apparently on the impact site where the bodies were found, and it was put in the back of a truck as guard with another fellow. And they said, don't look under the tarp. So immediately as the truck pulled away and there was nobody watching, he looked under the tarp.
Looked under the tarp, sure.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's kind of like, don't think of elephants. Well, now everybody's thinking about elephants.
Sorry.
So you don't look under the tarp. So he immediately looked under the tarp and described the creatures, and kind of the same thing that we've heard with the large head, very skinny, very small, childlike creatures, child-sized creatures, that sort of thing.
Kind of typical of the Greys description.
I don't want to say that, because I think the Greys has become too stigmatized in one way and stereotypical. I was going to say stigmatized and stereotypical, but on the order of that, a large head, very thin body, that sort of thing. Didn't really talk much about that. He told his wife and told his daughters about that. We didn't get to talk to Melvin Brown because he'd passed away before we got there. I think he eventually ended up in England on assignment in England. He married an English woman, and he just stayed in England. So we talked to his daughters. One of the criticisms was, well, Beverly Bean, one of the daughters, she talked about this, but the wife and the other daughter denied it. And I thought, would you like to see a videotape of the wife and the daughter talking about what they remembered that their father had said or husband had said about this sort of thing? So it kind of negated that criticism. Doesn't mean that Brown wasn't making it up. It just means that the criticism was invalid. So we've got some descriptions. Most of it's secondhand. We've had a number of people talk to us about what they look like. At one time, I thought I'd talked to 8 or 10 people who had seen the bodies, and of those, there's like 2 that really turned out to be legitimate people on that sort of thing. So it's where you are on that. But yeah, there was discussion of bodies. Bill Blanchard, who was the base commander, William Blanchard, he ended up as a 4-star general and was the assistant chief of staff at the Air Force. He was going to become the chief of staff, but he died of a heart attack in the Pentagon. Had a good friend named Chester Lytle. Chester Lytle was a scientist, worked on the trigger for the atomic bomb, for example. So he had security clearances and all this. Lytle and Blanchard were at a base in Alaska, Ellendorf, maybe. But Lytle's wife was pregnant and got a call that she was going into labor. So Blanchard arranged for a military aircraft to take him to the base. One of the bases in Illinois. I want to say Clark, but that's in the Philippines. The base there, so he could get to Chicago, where his wife was in the hospital. And on that flight, Blanchard mentioned to him that there had been 4 bodies. And Lytle was very reluctant to share that information. Finally shared it with, and it surprises me, with Robert Hastings. I mean, Don and I met with him a dozen times. We had meals with him and all this, and he never mentioned that to us. And then he mentioned it to Robert Hastings. So anyway, we do have some information, but it's not as persuasive as I'd like it to be. It's not as valuable as I would like it to be. It's not the proof positive you'd like to see, because it's basically stories. And even if the people says, yes, I saw the bodies, it's still just testimony, and we really need something a little bit more.
So let me throw another name into this mix that maybe you can shed some light on. Glenn Dennis supposedly knew someone at the Roswell Army Air Force Base, and he was contacted about getting small coffins. At least I remember that as part of the story. How accurate is that?
Well, first of all, let me do a plug. I did a book called Roswell in the 21st Century, which discusses some of this at length. And then I did another book later on called Understanding Roswell, which gives an awful lot of the background of the people and what happened to them and additional information like that. Glenn Dennis was, well, he was a mortician at the time, 1947. I think he was just an embalmer. And I said to him once that being a mortician was a grave undertaking, but I don't think he understood what I was talking about. Anyway, he talked about how he had gotten a phone call from the base, and they wanted to know if they had any small coffins that could be hermetically sealed, and they didn't have any there. He said he had to go to Amarillo to get them. My question was, why did he need small coffins? What difference did it make the size of the coffin if you could put the body in it, or put 2 of them in one of the coffins or something like that? All you needed was a thing that you could hermetically seal. General Exxon, for example, told me that one of the bodies eventually went to the Army's mortuary service in Denver, Colorado. I think it became Lowry Air Force Base, but that one of the bodies was sent there for research purposes. Anyway, Dennis told that tale, and then he said that he had he was a friend with a nurse. He's suggested it was much more intimate than
just being friends.
Yeah, just being friends. And he told us that he had been in he got a call that there had been a motorcycle accident. I guess there'd been a motorcycle accident downtown, and the mortuary service in a lot of small towns also ran the ambulance service. So he took a soldier out to the base hospital. And when he got there, he walked in, and this nurse, which he said who was named Naomi Self, and we know that's not true now, met him and said, "What are you doing here? You're going to get into trouble." And then this red-haired officer named Armstrong, I think he said, came to him and says, you get out of here. You don't belong in here, or something like that. And Dennis says, "You can't do anything. I'm a civilian." And he said, "Well, you'll find out what I can do." And he was with a black NCO, which caused some controversy as well later on, who said, they'll be picking your bones out of the desert, which I found amazing that a black NCO would say that to a white civilian in that time frame. I'm thinking in the time frame as opposed to in today's environment, that would have been no big deal.
Say?
Yeah, but anyway,
So the
So
story of the
Dennis
nurse
left,
was inaccurate.
but I'm getting to that.
Okay, you're getting there.
Patience, my man.
Okay, so
Patience, my man. I'm getting there.
yeah,
So anyway,
okay,
a day or two later, he met the nurse at one of the local watering holes downtown, and she was telling him about what she'd seen. She'd been called into this preliminary autopsy of these little creatures and drew what they looked for him on a napkin and then shredded it and burned it up. So according to the story, and Glenn Dennis says that he was having some kind of relation, although Glenn Dennis at the time was married and his wife was pregnant.
all right.
Um, but he claimed that he was writing to her in England where she'd been transferred, and the letter came back marked deceased, and he found out that she had been killed with four other nurses in an aircraft accident. Well, I went through the New York Times index for 1947, 48, 49, and 50, looking for any aircraft accident in which Army nurses had been killed and couldn't find anything. Don Berliner, who been deeply involved in UFO research for many, many years. He went through Stars and Stripes. Stars and Stripes is a military newspaper. If you're serving
Uh-huh.
overseas, you get copies of the Stars and Stripes. When we were in Iraq, I always looked for the Stars and Stripes because they carried Calvin and Hobbes. So we got to see what's going on with
Right,
Hobbes.
right.
But he could find no reference to it. We could find no reference to it. A guy named Vic Goyublik, and this is incredible. He got a roster of everybody in Squadron M, the medical squadron, in July of 1947. He got the medical record, the unit rosters, the morning reports from the beginning of, I think, 1946 to the end of 1947, and the morning reports is what he got. And if somebody joins the unit, it's mentioned. If they leave the unit, it's mentioned. If they're not present for duty, it's mentioned. If they're sick, if they're on TDY, this is mentioned in the morning report because it's supposed to provide a list of everybody who's available for duty at that site. And he couldn't find the name of Naomi Self. And he got a listing, like 125,000 women who'd served as nurses in the military, including going back to World War I, and her name
Wow.
didn't appear there. I worked with a police officer. We found four Naomi Selves, and it's an odd name, but we found four of them, and they weren't the right people. They were either too young or too old, or no indications they had ever been to Roswell. So I think Vic went to confront Dennis about that. And Dennis said to him, well, you guys were pressing me for a name. So I gave you a
Yeah.
name. I told you up front it wouldn't be the right name, but it's the name. Well, that's not what he had ever said to me. And in fact, I had we'd been looking for a guy named Robert Slusher. And Don had given me the name of a guy in Tennessee named Robert Slusher. And I called him. He says, yeah, he had served in World War II. He is a pilot, but he hadn't been in Roswell, and he was the wrong guy. So I was talking to Glenn Dennis about something else, and he said to me, "Why haven't you found my nurse?"
Hmm.
And I said, "Well, it's problematic because there are people who have the same names." And I said, "I was looking for. I just talked to a guy named Robert Slusher." And Dennis said to me, "Oh, I know Bob Slusher. He lives over in Las Cruces." And that was the right guy, so he did provide us with the name. But at that point, he said, "I gave you the name. Why can't you find her?" Later
Hmm.
on, when we couldn't find her, his story was, "I said up front I wasn't going to give you the right name." So
Oh gosh.
at that point, I knew he was lying, and to me, I was no longer interested in his stories because he had been impeached as a witness. I think Don Schmidt and Tom Carey um, believed him longer than I did. They eventually, I think Tom eventually came around, but Don realized that Glenn Dennis's testimony wasn't any good, and I think Tom eventually came around. We could find no nurses who civilian or military, who had worked in Roswell at the right time. And Vic Goyubik had done he when he couldn't find the name of a military nurse, he went through the local hospital and tried to find a civilian nurse with that name, but could never come up with that. So Glenn Dennis's testimony um, is probably bogus, and that's another thing that shows up in either Roswell in the 21st century or Understanding Roswell. That investigation and all that information comes out at that point. you know,
So, what is the, to go back to the reference to your books, what is the importance of Roswell? What does it really mean, or should it mean to the public?
Roswell, if Roswell is true, it answers all the questions. You know, we don't have to search for, well, we know that UFOs are interstellar craft. We know that they have been visiting Earth for a long time. We realize that they're mortal like we are. We realize they have a technology far superior. We don't get caught up in these arguments about semantics and trivia. We have the answer. And I think in 1947, if you look what the society was like in 1947, the Second World War had just ended. Horrific war, millions of people dead. The government was trusted by the civilian population. They're suddenly presented with something that is beyond our capability to understand. If we can crack the codes, we take a leap ahead of our competitors in the world because now we have this technology if we can reverse engineer it. I often say, but I don't think we have the technology even today to understand it. And the analogy I used to use, which was perfect, but then videotape went away. The idea was if you took a power pack, a TV, and a VCR back to Merlin the Magician, Middle Ages, and you show them, here's this black ribbon, decipher it. Well, to do that, you have to understand two things that are invisible: electricity and magnetism. He couldn't possibly duplicate it. He couldn't possibly understand it. And I think the Roswell technology is so far advanced that we are unable to understand it as well. I don't know. The only thing I can think of that we might have understood and might have made its way into our world would be the composite materials we use today instead of the steel and all of this. We're using composites to build our aircraft and things like that you wouldn't have expected in 1947. And maybe that provided a clue on how to create that sort of thing. Not saying it did, I'm saying it might have provided the clue. So I think that's why we don't know about it today. And it's one of the things that tells us that A, we're not alone in the universe, and B, interstellar travel is possible. But we can't get there yet. We don't understand it. I just read a story. I think it was Robert. When you get to my advanced age, sometimes names escape you. And
You're not that
Robert
more
Powell.
advanced than I am. So
Robert Powell. I just interviewed Robert Powell on Wednesday and was talking about some of this thing. And we were talking about interstellar flight in that fashion. And he mentioned something that was interesting. We actually are engaging in interstellar flight today. The Viking that was launched in the 1970s to go by Mars and loop through the solar system and then just keep on going. And it left the solar system 10 years ago or something. It was outside. It finally got outside the solar system and is traveling now in interstellar space. So we've got an interstellar craft out there motoring around. Best guess, it might come into a contact with the planet in 80,000 years. But then you go back to Avi Loeb, who claimed that we had a interstellar craft, something built outside the solar system, passed through the solar system
right.
5 or 6 years ago. He said it was traveling at sublight speeds. So it's like another race, which we have done, announcing themselves, here we are, we're out here. We're not on this craft, but we've sent out this probe to let you know we're here. We've done the same thing. We won't be flying through any solar systems in the near future, but another spacefaring race might come across it. And then we can always say, well, James Kirk came across it with the Enterprise.
James Kirk. Yeah.
and it didn't work out real well for him.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's just that sort of thing that we look at. So we talked about interstellar flight and the possibilities of it. There may be ways to defeat the distances that we don't understand. One of the examples physicists have used is you have a piece of paper and you put a dot at both ends. Well, it's 11 inches apart, but if you fold the paper in half, the dots can touch.
It, right.
Yeah, and there may be a way to bend space to our will. There might be wormholes that can be constructed. There might be wormholes out there that we could use to get to other places. Um, so, yeah, the vast distances bother me as well. And
Mhm.
there's other problems. I was talking to James Van Allen. Yeah, I'm dropping a name here. James Van Allen. I talked to him about UFOs, and he was said to me that the problem he has with interstellar flight at this point is that there's all kinds of hydrogen between the solar systems. Our galaxy is filled with hydrogen. And as you move a craft toward relativistic speeds, now you're like bombarding the craft with radiation. And he didn't understand how they could shield the occupants so they wouldn't get fried by that speed and that radiation. Ben Allen also said one other thing that just cracks me up in today's world. He said, the first go-to answer is an interstellar flight. He says, if you're in the middle of Wyoming and you hear the thunder of hooves, you don't expect zebra. Well, about
Right.
10 years, well, about 10 years ago, I was watching the news and they were talking about, I don't know whether it was a train or a zoo in the middle of Wyoming, and a bunch of zebra had escaped. And I'm thinking, well, there you go. You're in the middle of Wyoming. You hear the thunder of hooves, and it could
And
have
then
been zebra.
zebras. Yeah, could have been zebras.
I thought it was
So
just a bizarre coincidence.
you no doubt are familiar with David Grush and some of the things that he's talked about. So where does this put us, do you think, in terms of your interest in UFOs and where we're headed with this subject? Are we ever going to get to a point where the public A accepts it, and maybe the public does accept it much easier than some, at least parts of the public? Where are we at with this, or where do you hope we're at?
Well, I just put on my blog an analysis of some of Grush's testimony. He said that there was this big crash in Italy in 1933, that Mussolini got a hold of it, and eventually somehow the Vatican got a hold of it and gave it to the Americans at the end of the war. And he mentioned Roswell, of course. Um, and so I did a piece. He said there was like 12 crashes. So I did a piece speculating what could he be referring to, and what crashes are legitimate game. And I put that up on my blog, and I'll plug that. It's kevinrandle.blogspot.com. It's like the second article up there, looking at a number of crashes. The Italian thing is probably a hoax. I've got colleagues and friends in Italy who researched that story 20, 25 years ago and found a lot of flaws in it. I thought it was kind of an Italian version of MJ12.
Hmm.
Um, we know about Roswell. What other ones could he be talking about? Well, we know some of the people he's associated with in the past. He was at Skinwalker Ranch, for example, and we know some of the people who were there and what their belief structure is. So by looking at that sort of information, by the way, Jerry Clark cautioned me. He said, don't eliminate Grush's testimony just because he went to Skinwalker Ranch. And I said, I'm not. I'm just saying that he was there and he could have talked to these specific people because they were often there. And looked at like the Aztec crash from 1948, Kecksburg. I want to say Kex
Expert,
Harbor, but
right?
Shag Harbor in what is 67, I think it was. Talked about Kingman possibly as one of the crashes, but the crashes that got some publicity and a lot of people know about. And I say immodestly at the beginning of the posting that I'm probably the world's leading expert on UFO crashes now.
Hmm.
Now that Len Stringfield has passed away, I've inherited his mantle. I may be exaggerating, but I've done 2 books on UFO crashes, so I've done a lot of research
You
into
know,
that aspect of it.
now tell me your perspective on this. So much of the literature about UFO crashes seems to involve uh, areas of the country where there was a lot of nuclear testing going on, and certainly that was probably the. Well, yeah, what do you say about that?
Well,
Is that a possible
when
reason that
when
the
people
beings are coming here?
when people have asked me about why were there so many sightings in New Mexico, I often say, well, what was going on in New Mexico? The first atomic bomb was dropped on New Mexico.
Right.
We were doing rocket research trying to get into space. So if I'm a spacefaring race, I see our primitive attempts to do that, and we are understanding atomic energy. I want to understand these people right away. So I would be doing research in New Mexico to see what they happen to know. Um, but other crashes, Kingsman is which by the way, I believe is a hoax, but Kingman was up near Las Vegas where there wasn't atomic research going on.
Right.
Um, Kecksburg is not anywhere near
And that's in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania. It's nowhere near any uh, research areas like that, or atomic research areas. So I think you're kind of confusing um, Robert Hastings' work about UFO, a lot of UFO sightings over military bases and areas where there is atomic research or atomic weapons stored. And so we have some of that from Roswell, for example. And then Robert Hastings in his book, UFOs and Nukes, or Nukes and UFOs, talks about a lot of that over missile silos and
Hmm.
bases that have atomic weapons and things like that. I've talked to some of those guys as well about that. And so it's not that far fetched, but the crashes aren't happening with any regularity around those areas. I mean, you've got to look at it. The interstellar flight problem is one, but then again, you've traveled interstellar space and now you're just falling out of the sky. There are listings with 300 and more crashes on it.
Hmm.
Well, that's just preposterous. My book, Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky, has got 118 sightings or crashes listed in it. Vast majority are single witness. Vast majority don't have a lot going for it. Of course, we talk about Roswell. We talk about Kecksburg. We talk about Shag Harbor. Um, I know Stan Gordon's probably mad at me because I kind of am leaning toward Kecksburg being a bolide, very bright meteor. Um, I,
We
I've
just
got a
had Stan on one of our podcasts.
yeah. I'm gonna get him on my program here sometime in the near future as well. He sends me a lot of information, which is very helpful. Shag Harbor is looking really good thanks to Chris Stile and Don Ledger. And unlike Roswell, they got stacks of government documents about it. We got virtually
Hmm.
nothing for Roswell. So you look at all of that stuff. I think the majority of the crashes are just misidentifications. A lot of them fell out of the sky in Sweden during the ghost rockets of 1947. Well, I'm sorry, 1946. At the time, they thought the Soviets were trying to intimidate the Swedes by flying these things over Sweden or over Scandinavia, but that hasn't panned out. And I know Chris, not Styles. Oh, uh, I should write these names down and have it list on my wall here.
Yeah, be
Um,
easier.
the, the guy from Scandinavia, from Sweden, um, who was colleague, and I communicate with him periodically. Um, was going to one of these UFOs, one of these ghost rockets fell in a lake, and they were going to do some research and see if they could get a hold of it. And I think that was supposed to take place last summer. I haven't heard anything about that. Oh my goodness, Chris, somebody. Well,
It'll
anyhow,
come to you.
yeah, about 4 hours from now,
Yeah, 4 hours from now. At least
which won't.
it'll come to you.
I could turn around and grab the book off my bookshelf back there, but uh, that's sort of annoying. So, but I think the majority of the crashes are explainable in terrestrial terms.
Hmm.
Uh, there might be, a lot of them in the United States, and I'm thinking, why do they keep crashing in the United States? Wouldn't be crashing in the Soviet Union at the time, and Europe, and
Well, there
South America.
probably have been
Well,
crashes.
but see that kind of, I just don't think there's that many.
Hmm.
It just seems impossible. Well, we're going to go to Earth. We better be careful because nobody else is coming back from there.
Yeah, bad news,
They're
huh?
all falling. They're falling out of the sky. Some kind of a Bermuda Triangle around
Hmm.
Earth or in the solar system. Stay careful. The solar triangle.
The solar triangle. Well,
Yes.
Kevin, I don't want to keep you the rest of your evening. I've appreciated this conversation. Once again, why don't you plug your blog that you have and your most current books and where you can get your current books about Roswell? Well, give yourself a
Well,
little PR.
yeah, well, the blog is kevinrandle.blogspot.com. It's called A Different Perspective. And if you type A Different Perspective into your search engine, you usually come up with the blog, and you can get to it that way. There's like 1,400 articles that I published on there. I think I started it in 2007, so it's been around for a while. The latest book on UFOs is called Understanding Roswell, and it's intense, deep look at a lot of the personalities who were there, what happened to them, um, in later life. Why haven't we interviewed them, and that sort of thing. I did Understanding Roswell, which takes a long look at the Project Mogul explanation. I think pretty well wipes it out about that. They're available on, of course, Amazon and things like that. I'll also plug, I've done a series of books as Eric Helm about, well, they're not about my experiences in Vietnam. They're fiction about Green Berets in Vietnam, and I wasn't a Green Beret, but I worked with the Green Berets as a helicopter pilot periodically. And but descriptions of the locations and things like that were places I was, so I could describe them pretty accurately. And in fact, one of the units I served with in Vietnam, the 116th Assault Helicopter Company called the Hornets, they wrote to the publisher and said, one of the guys writing these books has either been there or knows somebody who has been there. And it turned out, it was somebody from my unit in Vietnam had recognized my descriptions of the areas. So things like that. But Vietnam Ground Zero, look up Eric Helm. I've done science fiction as Eric Helm. I've done science fiction as Kevin Randle. I've done a lot of UFO books. One of the best UFO books, I think, is cleverly called Levelland, about the Levelland sightings from November of 1957, where the UFO stalled cars and there were literal dozens of witnesses to this. And the Air Force spent the Lonnie Zamora sighting called Encounters in the Desert, for example, and did a book called UFOs in the Deep State, and shows how some of this information has been manipulated for the last 70 years and how come it's still a secret after 70 years. So that's a long compendium of some of my books. You can go to Amazon and it'll show you all my books, both as Eric Helm and Kevin Randle, and you can decide which ones you'd like to purchase and provide a 5-star rating.
Yeah. And I just based on this conversation, I don't have to read any of those books, and I'd give you a 5-star rating. So thank you very much for spending time with us. As soon as we get this up on the website, our YouTube website, we'll send you a link, and you can do whatever you want with us with it.
Well,
but thank you very much.
Well, I just put on my blog a series of links of some of the last things I've done in the last week or 10 days, especially my interviews with other people. So I'll of course put that up on the blog as well, and so people can take a look at it there.
Okay.
And thank
Kevin,
you so
thank you.
and thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Sure, anytime. All right. Have a good evening.
You too.